table. Today's guest, oh, thank you. Today's guest is Professor Iain Allan. Okay. Logistics first. Wonderful. For the lecturer, is much easier and funnier to have audience closer. So, as I said, today's guest is Professor Dr. Iain Allan from Cass Business School. So today's event is organized in the collaboration between the Faculty of Business Studies and Cass Business School, which belongs to the City University of London. The Professor Allan will speak about the relationship between, let's say, banks and insurance sector. Especially he will focus on the reasons why crisis has a different influence in the banking sector on the one hand and also in the insurance sector on the other hand. And at the end he will focus and also stress directive Solvency II directive, which gives maybe more freedom to the insurances. It's more principle based and allows us judgment approach, and maybe a kind of deregulation in this sense is maybe the reason why insurances haven't felt banking or crisis last years in the way banks did. And Professor Allan, okay, the word is yours. And,
thanks. It's very nice to be here and meet you this evening. So I'm going to talk about this balance between regulation and ethics or judgment in banking and insurance. I realise that many of you may not have worked in these industries, so in my talk I'll go through a number of short points and hope at the end we get to the same place. So if you get a bit lost in the middle, please just go to the end and it'll join up at the end. So you might ask, why should I talk about this subject? What do I know about it? So first of all, I am an actuary. I trained in Edinburgh in Scotland as an actuary. And in my career, I have worked for both banks and insurance companies. Actually more for banks, but I have worked for both. So the first thing I want to do is to talk through some aspects of my own experience. Because not only did I work for insurance companies and banks, but unhappily, I worked for some that had problems, so we can consider why did they have problems, or why did others not have problems. So I'll go through 6 little stories from my experience, 3 happy, 3 not so happy. After leaving university, where I studied maths, I went to train as an actuary. This was in Edinburgh. I went to a mutual life insurance company. Mutual means the policyholders own the business. So there are no shareholders. This is some benefit because you have the short-term pressure. Sometimes the stock market puts very short-term pressure on management. So an advantage of the mutual was you could take a long-term view of the business and a long-term view of employees and developing employees. And most people who work there stay forever, and it's a very happy place. I chose to work in investment. I went to London, but I'm still very friendly with that company after 40 years. I left 40 years ago, and every year when I go to Edinburgh, my previous boss invites me for lunch in his house. Very nice atmosphere. So in that sense, mutual was very good, very cooperative, very successful. I wanted to work in investments, not really as an actuary, so I went to London and worked for another mutual company. But But this moved from happy to not so happy. While mutuals have many advantages, nice place to work, nice people, and so on, a recognised problem is corporate governance. There is not the discipline of shareholders. So if something goes wrong, it's not very clear outside, and the shareholders don't put pressure on. So although I didn't know it when I went to this insurance company, the chairman was, in English, a megalomaniac, power-crazy dictator, a mad person. And not unusual if you have this kind of person in charge. Although he was the chief chairman, he behaved like chief executive. And not surprising for such a person, his management team was very weak, nobody would dare argue with him. So he was all-powerful, like a mad dictator. And the problem I perceived was he was very interested in investments. He liked investments, he liked buying and selling shares. But he had no understanding about liabilities, none at all. And I left for that reason. I'm happy to say I had a big argument with him about there are assets, there are also liabilities, and some years later, the insurance company didn't go bust, but the government made it be taken over by another insurance company. So in insurance we saw a good business model, but the absence of shareholders meant there was not public transparency when something went wrong. In stage 2 of my career, and then from experience here, was quite different. At this time, in 79, Mrs. Thatcher came to power, exchange controls were removed, markets became international. So I went to work for a UK stockbroker. You wouldn't have heard it, it was called Phillips & Drew, he was a very good stockbroker. So we advised customers on buying and selling shares. And I developed an international business, particularly with central banks. Now this was another very happy, good period. This is a partnership. So if you work in a partnership, you want to work with your colleagues. If we're all successful, we're all better. So the partnership model was a bit like mutual. It had very good strengths in collaboration in the team. Another strength of this is before Big Bang, as a stockbroker, we did sales, not trading. And that meant two things. First of all, we focused on customers. We gave advice as we thought. We didn't have a trading position of our own to distract us. Another feature here, which may be relevant to some banking problems, is that the partnership had unlimited liability. So we could lose all our money, our house, everything. I still think that investment banking, which is quite fun, should not be bailed out. I think it should be this kind of model, a partnership model, like a private equity fund. If you make money, good luck to you. If you lose money, you've had it. So Phillips & Drew was a very good partnership. Then we had Big Bang in the city, as had happened in the United States, and things immediately went from very good to very bad. A first aspect, which is the problem of large banks, is that they can be very political. I'm not gossiping, I'm not telling stories. Books are written about the politics of UBS. Very destructive in the organisation, management fighting all the time for seniority. Another problem which made life terrible very quickly was that after Big Bang, in this investment business, you had this fundamental conflict of trading and sales. So I did sales, I spoke to central banks. Now we had traders shouting at us to sell stuff or get stuff or do things, not because it suited the client, to suit the trading position of the company. As with the Glass-Steagall Act in America, trading and sales makes a fundamental conflict of interest. It is impossible to live with this. And the third problem, which I was very surprised about at UBS, was their level of what we would call business ethics. They hid behind Swiss banking secrecy. A very public problem was that we were involved in there was a company called Blue Arrow, which had a big share offering at a high point in the market. Nobody bought the stock. UBS said it's all sold, but they sold it to themselves, to their own funds. They hadn't sold it to proper customers at all. So this was not good. I really didn't like the problem there. There's nothing you could do. It is a large Swiss bank, and you're like some foreign idiot. You've no power in a Swiss bank. So I left there, and at that time, 20 years ago, I became a visiting professor at Cass, and that's been very good. We'll not talk about that tonight. Having been interested in banking, I went to a Scottish bank. In November, I went to a Scottish bank called the Royal Bank of Scotland. At the time I went, it was very good to start working there. It was a small bank that had quite a friendly culture again. It had a very good chief executive at the time, George Matheson, very good guy. And one of the good things working there, I said there was some benefits in mutuality. You didn't have shareholder pressure. Some benefits in partnership, everyone cooperated. Because it's a small bank, it was always worried it would be taken over by a large English bank. So I found that the fear of being taken over meant the bank performed and behaved very well. There were two specific outcomes of that. It was trying to be highly priced share, not to be taken over. So it focused on stable growth by doing simple things, by supporting its customers, giving good relationships with the customers, meeting the needs of its customers. Very simple, basic banking. Another benefit was that it was determined not to have any setback, not to have any trading problems or other such setbacks which could make it vulnerable to being taken over. So it was steady growth, low risk, just the sort of bank you'd want to put your money into if you're buying bank shares. And in the period I was there, the very good track record developed from that scenario enabled the Royal Bank of Scotland to take over the English bank NatWest, which was more than twice as big. But, as you will read in business books, things started to go wrong. The same company changed. The acquisition of NatWest was a very good acquisition, and it was delivered very well. You would read Harvard Business Study case or others. The integration of RBS and NatWest saved lots of money, improved NatWest, so it both reduced cost and grew the income. But, as you might find in the kind of airport, the kind of business books you buy at the airport, the mood of the company changed. These English words you would read of hubris, or megalomania, or world domination, all kinds of things began to be part of the new chief executive, now infamous Fred Goodwin rather than George Matheson. So it is very sad, but it's absolutely typical of these business case studies that success led to overconfidence and then to disaster. Two aspects of the disaster were that in a very crazy move, RBS was part of a consortium taking over ABN AMRO, even when the credit crunch was beginning to bite. And this was just part of megalomania, but it also reflected the opposite of what I'd seen before. When I joined the chief executive in the smaller RBS, he was always afraid of being taken over. Not every minute, every day, but all the time. Every action in the bank was to make it safe against takeover. After RBS had bought NatWest, it was too big to be taken over. We didn't use then the phrase too big to fail. We weren't hanging up with it. The thing was too big to be bought. There was no other bank that could buy it. An American bank, in theory, was big enough, but it wouldn't have the cost-saving synergies that a domestic bank would. So this was a real problem, which is behind the global banking crisis now that large banks are not afraid of being taken over. So no matter what they do, they either carry on or the government bails them out. So the first bad move was obviously buying ABN AMRO, and the second move, which is perhaps more incompetence than badness, like many other banks, was buying these toxic securities, the collateralized debt obligations, the subprime stuff, and so on. So in my career, this is how my career, there are ups and downs at home and at work. I have seen these things, and therefore in my work at CAS, rather than do what many of my actuary colleagues would do, very big sums and complicated maths, I've thought more about these businesses and the ethics and what drives it. And I've thought a lot in particular about the subject tonight, whether regulation makes people ethical or makes them not ethical. Here, ethical isn't a Catholic or, for me, Protestant religious thing. By ethics, I mean responsible, good judgment in the long-term interests and not in personal interests. I don't mean a religious or fluffy thing, I mean common sense and good judgment. So before I come on to the current and future, when I went through that experience, another in the UK, I'm talking about UK because I'm from the UK and because the UK is a very important financial centre. So I'm talking about the UK not only because I know it, but because it is like a big Cyprus, its financial sector is too big, so you see these problems. In America, they could absorb them, they can move on. So in my 40-year career, there was a very famous incident of Equitable Life, an insurance company did go bust. So, although I'm an actuary, and would like to think insurance is better, and I do think it's better, we have to realise that some insurance companies did fail. The UK regulator did a very good analysis of the reasons, and although they might have found some specific reasons, they did not think the regulatory framework was a problem at all. In general, it was management problems. And the chief executive of Equitable Life was another mad, power, crazy person. Everyone knew that. Nobody had to say it, but everybody knew it. So when insurance companies have failed, there are not many. They are more isolated. And I think you would not say regulation is a problem. You would say the management was a problem, often a single person. Often the problem with insurance companies was they grew too quickly and ran out of capital. So it wasn't a bad thing, it was a very silly thing. In banks, it's quite different. Forever, banks didn't go bust, and then suddenly, so many big banks and some smaller ones did go bust in many countries. So it's a very different scenario. You know, you might be worried about your deposits now after Cyprus, if you were rich and had all your money in one bank. But you would never have worried all your life before about this. You'd have thought banks were safe. So we need to consider why, which we'll come back to at the end, but just to think about what has happened, there is a lot of regulation of banking. It's very detailed. There's lots of rules. But the rules do not apply to behaviour. The rules are economic rules, numbers, capital ratios, risk-weighted assets, other things. They do not allow for behaviour. And even before this crisis in 2008, we saw over and over again banks getting round the rules. You had more and more rules, and then banks just got round the rules. So in my career in banking, you had the Basel Accord, Basel I. People got rounded by securitization, by making loans into securities. Then you had Basel II. So Basel I was this big, Basel II was this big, and people got rounded by having offshore funds, by having complicated derivatives. And then you have Basel III this big, and people are getting around that. So there has been a difference in the problems in banking insurance. So now in the second half, I want to talk a little, it's slightly boring, but we need to know it, about the regulations, the Basel regulations, Solvency II. Are they the same? Are they different? Do they support ethics? Ethics, again, in the sense of responsible judgment. So I'm going to mention about 6 things that are different between Basel and Solvency II. These documents are massive. You would never want to read them. So I'm going to highlight 6 things which, having worked in banking, worked in insurance, I see as quite different. In Basel and Solvency, there are 3 pillars. That's how the 3 sections of the rules. The first is about calculating your risks and the capital you need for the risks. Both banks and insurance companies do that. The second is about the supervisory review process by your regulator. Same idea in both Basel and Solvency II. And the third is the assumption that you're a shareholder company is what your public disclosures should be, so that you have market discipline by shareholders. So when you look at Basel and Solvency, Pillar 1, Pillar 2, Pillar 3, they look the same. So what are the key differences? First of all, in both Basel and Solvency, you can work out your capital under 2 different approaches. One is called the standard approach, where there'll be a table of numbers and proportions, and you apply it to your assets and liabilities, add them up, and that's your capital. So it's standard, it's simple. If companies want to do that, they can do it. The other approach is to have your own risk models.